Welcome back. I want to introduce our panel this afternoon. Joining us from Sydney, Tom Switzer from the US Studies Centre, and also from the Australian, Jeff Elliott, business editor of the Australian and the former Washington correspondent. Jeff, you were there in Washington covering, of course, the Barack Obama's campaign back in 2008 very closely. He is being treated like a rock star wherever he goes here in Australia. He's very popular here, even in the Chamber of Parliament today after his speech. We saw MPs and senators mobbing him, getting autographs and the rest of it. I mean, what have you thought of the President's visit? Is there any surprise in the celebrity that seems to surround him here?
Oh, no, not at all, David. I mean, I saw all this fold out in the States as his presidential campaign grew and grew. And he has a sort of a laid-back, laconic, easy style that is immediately attractive, particularly to the Australian psyche, I think. So I think it was never in doubt that he would be a very popular figure here. And certainly, as you say, that witnessing those scenes out of Parliament today were quite extraordinary. Again, reminded me a lot of the campaign, in fact. Yeah,
well, he seems to have lost some of that appeal back home, but not abroad. He's still very popular.
Yeah, well, look, of course, and he has a lot of problems at home, and I guess we'll get into this in the discussion. But a very interesting speech today. But look, is he going to make it into a second term? So a lot of what we discussed today really hinges on that question. But the economy in the US at least is further down the path, I guess, than Europe. So he does have that in his favour. But they've got a lot of work to do, and at the end of the day, the economy is really what will see him elected or not.
Tom, what did you make of the President's speech in Parliament today? And just getting to that issue about, the elections due in the United States next year, is this an Obama vision for the Asia-Pacific, or is this an American vision that is bipartisan, that will be shared regardless of the election?
Mixed feelings, David. On the one hand, it's obviously a good thing to welcome an American president. We've only had 4 other presidents who have visited Australia, and I think the speech touched the right notes about the deep roots between Canberra and Washington over a 60-year period. In fact, it goes back, as the Prime Minister said, to 1941, when a Labor Prime Minister turned to America. But on the other hand, leaving Asia aside for the moment, I was quite struck that in a 3,500 word speech, the President only dedicated 1 paragraph to Afghanistan, while the Prime Minister forgot about it altogether. Now, this is quite astonishing when you consider that Australia and America have been based in Afghanistan for more than a decade, a longer period of time than both our contributions to World War I and World War II. And by all accounts, the war is not going well. I found that quite striking.
But, I mean, I guess in his defence, he talked about it at the news conference. He went to the War Memorial this morning to pay his respects. This was a speech about the Asia-Pacific. This was about pivoting away from the Middle East.
But then again, President Bush was also very much committed to the Asia-Pacific region during his 8 years in the White House. I mean, still had the 70,000+ US troops based in South Korea, Japan, enhanced the relationship with India. And in his speech to Parliament in October 2003, I think a significant segment was dedicated to Iraq. So, look, I take your point. Asia is a major focus of American foreign policy, but I think it, generally speaking, always has, certainly since the end of the war. And I think there is a danger in overstating the significance of the President's speech. I mean, a lot of what Julia Gillard and President Obama announced yesterday, that was already in the works with, Alexander Downer and Brendan Nelson and, of course, Dick Cheney back 5 years ago were talking about these very issues. So this is just a consistent connection.
Jeff, Barack Obama is...
David, Sorry, I was going to just mention the fact that, one of the reasons perhaps that they've set up, or Obama and the President has set up such a strong message on the Asia-Pacific is that, the US is watching what is going on down here in terms of China, its investments in Australia and the Asia-Pacific growth story. So putting on my business editor's hat here at the moment, when you're sitting in Washington and looking at the global economic landscape and you're seeing Europe sort of sliding into the abyss, it seems, at the moment, you really need to position yourself commercially, if you like, economically and geopolitically into a region that has got all the growth. And the US is going to need all the growth it can get from anywhere for its corporations in the years ahead. I think that might be a significant part of the thinking behind this. It's where you've got to follow the money, as they say.
Well, I was going to ask you, Jeff, about the domestic pressure that he's under on the jobs front and trying to fix the budget mess as well. It seems a lot of what he's had to say and the way he's carried himself during this sweep through the region. I mean, no silly Hawaiian shirts at APEC in Hawaii, all very business-like. And every opportunity he gets, he's talking about the trade opportunities, the job opportunities, bashing China on the trade and currency front as well. All of that directed back home to deal with the pressure that he's under on trying to create some jobs.
Yeah, well, they often say that about these presidential trips, particularly at a time when, when the economy is in very bad shape in the US, although recovering, I might add. It looks like it's getting a bit better. That he doesn't want to be seen, doing those sort of silly stunts or laughing it up overseas. So yes, the pivot is always back into the US economic scene. And I think that's a critical issue for him. And at the same time, look, the thing with Obama is what I saw on the presidential campaign in terms of his second term chances. I saw on that campaign not to underestimate him. I think that you never underestimate a president and his position in the ability to win a second term. But it's, as a betting man, it would be half and half at best, I would have thought at the moment.
And Tom Switzer, we've focused a lot on the reaction to this. China hasn't been terribly happy. The Indonesian foreign minister's expressed some concerns about the announcement on US troops, more of them being based in Australia. I just want to replay a little bit of the CCTV, the China Central Television anchor we were talking to at the top of the show, what he thought about this.
I think the fact that the Australian government has agreed to deploy American troops in Darwin has sent a mixed message, if not a wrong signal, to the Chinese audiences here, because we believe you have somehow been held hostage by the American global ambition and the agenda of American domestic politics. Well, by the way, the number of 250 is a stupid figure for the Chinese. If you turn to your Chinese friends and figure out what the implications of 250 mean. But I believe pretty soon that number will be increased to a few thousand of American Marines.
Tom, just quickly, I guess it's not surprising that Beijing isn't thrilled at the idea of more Americans in the region.
No, and of course they've always known that Australia's had a close relationship with America, certainly since the Communist Revolution in China. Look, to put it in some sort of geopolitical perspective, if China's rises like other great powers, including the United States, it's only understandable to think that its definition of what it considers vital interests will grow as its power increases. And that means, if you follow the logic of the rise of power politics, that a state like China will want to eventually flex its muscles in what it sees as its sphere of influence. Now, at the same time as the Defence White Paper acknowledged 2 years ago, the United States' preeminence is coming to an end in Asia. Now, what does that mean for the balance of power, and what does it mean for Australia? Tough decisions ahead. If there is a spat between Washington and Beijing and the Spratly Islands or the South China Sea or the Taiwan Straits, where would Julia Gillard sit? It's not altogether clear in light of the fact that we have this close security relationship with America on the one hand, but also a rapidly developing trade relationship with China. The prospects of conflict in the South China Sea really can't be dismissed.
Jeff, what do you think about this and how worried should Australia be about what does at least appear to be growing signs of tension?
Well, this question is it's not the first time it's come up, right? The balancing the economic interest with the political and alliance interest with the US is one that requires a huge amount of dedication on the part of DFAT and politicians from both sides of the fence in Canberra to manage what is going to be increasingly delicate. The amount of Chinese investment into this country at the moment is staggering, and unless there's a massive economic meltdown and China slows down as well, I suspect that's going to continue.
Yeah, I'll just remind you of what happened in 2004 briefly. The then Foreign Minister Alexander Downer was in Beijing, and he was asked a hypothetical question by a Chinese journalist: what would Australia's response be in the event of a standoff between Washington and Beijing? To which he replied, the ANZUS Pact would not apply. Now, that caused all sorts of dramas in Washington. Kevin Rudd, the then Shadow Foreign Minister, came down on him like a ton of bricks, and John Howard quite skillfully managed to get Downer out of the mess he created and gave a more ambiguous response. And that's what this will require, a lot more ambiguity, agility, qualified commitment for America. It's a different ballgame.
Yeah, and certainly Julia Gillard has been a lot more circumspect when she's been asked about some of these specific issues on the currency, on intellectual property, on China's increasing military assertiveness in the South China Sea. She has been a lot more ambiguous. Tom, has that been sensible?
Well, I mean, I think it's certainly sensible to be ambiguous, and I think John Howard was actually a master of the diplomatic trade in that regard, but I'm not so sure she's been so nuanced. I mean, I think I've been struck by the ideological odyssey of Julia Gillard. Only a few years ago, she championed, this is while she was a rising Labor star, she championed the notion of an independent foreign policy, which is a left-wing code for creating distance between Australia and Uncle Sam. Well, how times have changed. I mean, where are all the protests from the usual suspects thinking that she's an American lickspittle or a sycophant or a little Julia? I mean, John Howard copped all this criticism, remember, for being close to the Americans. Julia Gillard seems to have escaped that, and yet she's arguably been just as close to Washington as Prime Minister Howard was.
Well, I noticed Bob Brown put out a press release today saying that there needed to be a more independent foreign policy approach, but in the chamber he was shaking hands with Barack Obama
there you go.
very warmly.
Chalk and cheese.
I was struck by that. I was struck by that too, David. And let's not forget, Julia Gillard has been resetting that compass for some time now too. I saw her speech in the State Department some years back, and that was a remarkable example of alliance building and kumbaya moments where she lauded former Foreign Minister Downer and Treasurer Costello in that audience.
That's when she got into power, though, Jeff. She mugged by reality.
That's right, Tom. I agree. All
right. On that note of agreement, we will have to wrap things up. Tom Switzer,
Thanks,
Jeff Elliott, great to talk to you both. Thanks for that.